You can't be there. Hi guys, it's April and I garden down in southeast Nebraska. And about a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, I showed my spreadsheet on how I track the year in the garden. I thought it would be cool today to sit with Albus and walk through how last year's gardening season went. I have my harvest over the years spreadsheet that I'm going to walk you through. If you want a full walkthrough of all of these spreadsheets, I will link the video that I did last year. But I figured I'd just go over the years section of my record keeping just so we can kind of see how things have gone the same or changed as I've been gardening for the last 3 years. So I am going to go over to the computer, maybe get this guy settled, and we'll see how things went. Okay, so this is my harvest over the years spreadsheet. As you can see, it only covers 2021, 2022, and 2023. That is as long as I've been gardening, just those 3 years. I am going to zoom in so you can see some of this a little better. This is the rainfall tab. My local university research branch, my extension office, have collected a lot of this data, and so each day I got a rainfall total for my area. It wasn't until about maybe March or so this year that I got my own weather station, which means before March of 2023, all of this information was gathered from that research project, from that branch of the extension office. So they're not quite tailored to my area. They're tailored to my city, but not to my area. But it's this year I've finally started honing in and grabbing that information. As you can see, December isn't completely filled out yet. I don't have that completely filled because obviously we still have a little over a week of December left, so it doesn't make sense to have that information. But so far we are running a little behind on the water totals that we're normally used to. We do have a lot of rain coming in the next couple of days, especially over the Christmas weekend, so we'll see how that shifts that. But so far, this has been the driest growing season that I've taken part in. I did map out a line chart just to see how each month compares to each other. I thought it was cool looking. It doesn't have maybe useful information. Maybe it does. It depends on how you look at all of this information, because we can see in June in all 3 of those years it was pretty close to the same amount of rain. But when you come over to May, that's when things go a little different. This year was really dry because 2023 is in that gray. Last year it was really, really wet, which is that green line, and the year before it was right in between. Just interesting information. And then I just have a bar chart that just shows the total compared to each other. I don't know, I thought it was fun. Next we have the temperatures through each of the years. Once again, I will zoom in for you. Up at the top, I don't think this is in my last year's video. This was just recently added. I started tracking when our last freeze was, last frost, whatever you want to call it, and our first freeze was, so that I could figure out what our growing days were compared to all of the expected advertised averages for first and last frost dates that you can find on the internet, and how long our growing seasons were. And of course, because I now have my own weather station, I can find it for my little microclimate and start to figure out what the average is there. So just looking at this, we can see that sometime early May, late April is usually when we have our last frost, whereas our first freeze is anywhere between mid-October and late October, which I think is pretty close to what is calculated for our first and last, which is part of the reason why a lot of times around here I have heard, you don't start planting until after Mother's Day. And then you start pulling things out right before Halloween. So that makes sense. And then I just have this bar chart just showing the growing season and how many days the growing season is. And then I have it calculating what our average is. And it's about 174 days. Underneath it, I have our average highs and our average lows per month that have been calculated from the tracking that I have done, just to see how it changes per month and what it looks like on a curve. Because obviously the temperature as it gets warmer is peaking in the middle of the growing season, and then of course coming back down, which is why I called it a curve. It is pretty steady, if I'm honest. I mean, the May section is usually where things may vary, but that's because it's figuring out when its last frost wants to be. But otherwise, it's pretty consistent with both the high and the low temperatures. It's just wintertime when you're in the March area where things might be a little different. So March and May are where the temperatures get really interesting, especially since that's when you're starting to look at, okay, when can I start planting things out? Because sometimes late March is when I get some of those cool weather crops out, like the lettuces and things like that, depending on how crazy I'm getting. I don't know. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, but it's seeing some of this information that gives you some of those standards that you can start setting up in your garden of when is a good time, when is a good average to start thinking about putting these things in the ground. And can I rely on past data to say, hey, we won't suddenly get some kind of weather coming through and wiping everything out. So that is this section of the spreadsheet. And it looks like this year was the year we had the longest growing season. It didn't give us a good freeze until the end of October. And I have not seen that for a while. We usually have, in the past, I remember growing up and having snow on the ground for Halloween. It was cold for Halloween this year, but we just seem to be having warmer and warmer years, which I don't know if is a good thing or not, but that's just kind of the pattern that is forming through all of this. But this is the fun part, the harvest summary. So I know there are better ways to do this. A lot of people will track their information by weight, which makes more sense. I get that. But I am a one-woman operation. I need to keep my own sanity. So I have always just counted the number of things that I have harvested. Maybe someday I will transition over to getting that in pounds or ounces or whatever. But here I have them by how many of that item that I was able to put in my basket and use. So the beans didn't do too well this year, and that part of that is because of how I planted and they were an afterthought, which is why in 2024 I want to have a bean year. I want a lot of my garden to be centered around beans. The same can be said about my bunching onions. I forgot about my bunching onions this year. All of my bunching onions were in pots. That wasn't true in the past. I had some in the actual garden beds in the previous years. But this year, all of my bunching onions were in pots. That's just where I had space. And I had so much other things going on that I never gravitated towards the bunching onions unless I was doing a dish that specifically asked for the tops of the bunching onions. Because otherwise, if it was asking for onions, I just went and grabbed one of the slicer onions, which as we get further down on the list, you will see I had over 350 slicing onions. Right here in this box. This is my slicer onions, which is why I only ended up harvesting 9 of my bunching onions. It's interesting how the gardening season can shift because of what's going on in your life, because last year I had 416 bunching onions. And I was still eating some of those freezer onions up through March, and it was amazing. And I kind of miss having that. So maybe I think about doing a little bit better with my bunching onions. My butternuts also did very well this year, and that might be because I had that test plot going on for the local university that I am a part of, and I put a lot of my squashes in that area, and then I had a lot of other squashes in my garden beds. So I had maybe 6 or so butternut plants that I was harvesting from, and in the past I had struggled to keep those plants productive and alive because of the squash bugs. But this year I managed to get at least 60 different butternuts. So we've been eating those. I still have a whole bunch that I need to process of both butternut and pumpkins that I need to figure out something to do with. Didn't do cabbage this year because I'm still running off of a lot of cabbage that I grew last year. Carrots, I have pretty much figured out my good average of carrots. I still have a lot up in the refrigerator that I am using for various different soups and other things. This was my first year doing celery. I probably could have harvested more off of them, but I did not. Celery isn't something I've used a lot of in my cooking before, but it is something that I do want to add into my cooking because I know it adds some valuable nutrition and things like that. And now that we are in winter time and we're starting to do our soups and things like that, our stocks, I think the celery that I have harvested will come in handy. My corn was an interesting thing that happened this year. I did not plant corn in expectation of getting corn. I planted corn for the stalks so that I had decoration for October. I think I've gotten the most corn, by 1 ear, that I have gotten in a while. The first year I tried to grow sweet corn. I had a fight with all of the other things that like to eat sweet corn. But 2022, I started growing popcorn instead, and that has turned out to be very successful. And I think I'm always going to have a small patch of popcorn, even if I'm not growing it for the actual kernels, in my garden. Cucumbers, I decided to skip this year because I still have a whole bunch of pickles and a whole bunch of cucumber jelly, and I don't eat a lot of fresh cucumbers. So that was just something that I didn't really need. As you can see, last year I grew almost 400 cucumbers. A good chunk of that ended up being gifted and donated to other people. So I decided it wasn't something that I needed to focus on this year. But I did start eggplants. Now these 200 and some eggplants that I harvested are miniature eggplants. This is the fairy tale variety, and I liked that size because we will put it in stir fry and things like that, so we don't need a huge eggplant. I usually don't do eggplant parmesan and things like that, so I don't need a larger eggplant. The fairy tale variety gave us a good size for just cutting a couple up and putting it in stir fry. Garlic was a pretty good season. It was probably our best, even though it doesn't look like it in number wise. The first year I did garlic and we got nearly 100 cloves of garlic. We also got very small garlic heads because I planted them directly in the ground and not in my garden beds with that fluffy soil. So they never really got big enough for me to enjoy actually using them. But this year I've gotten garlic heads that are pretty decently sized and I don't mind using them, which is a big thing. I've always disliked using fresh garlic because it's so much work to get those cloves out. But this year I've just been doing it for nearly every meal and having no issues. So I did something right this year. So I'm counting that as a win. The ground cherries. I had a very big patch of volunteer ground cherry, and I also tried a new variety of ground cherry, which resulted in quite a bit of ground cherries. This was too much. I'm probably not going to start inside any ground cherries. I'm just going to see what ends up volunteering this next year because my husband does like to eat these. And I have found that these do make a good jelly and a good barbecue sauce. I don't like eating ground cherries fresh, but it adds a really good note to a barbecue that I find that I like. So I might do that again next year. Didn't grow any melons because I don't really like melons. Peas was a pretty good year. The dogs ate most of them. I like to use peas for snacks, so they get a lot of those snow peas that they can just snack on in the garden while I'm doing whatever it is I'm doing. Potatoes went nuts this year. I don't remember if I bought more than I normally do, or they just produced better than they normally do. I just got them in the right spot, but they did well. This year I have the same Magic Molly that I have purchased, and I think there is another variety that I am going to be trying and trialing again this year, but I honestly don't remember. I pre-ordered it maybe a month ago, so that'll be a surprise for both of us. I have contemplated doing sweet potatoes before, but maybe that'll be 2025. Pumpkins I got a lot of, which once again I think was because of that test plot that I did. It just did really well. Plus I got the pink banana pumpkins, pink banana squash, whatever you want to call them, the candy roasters. I got those to grow really well this year, and so I have a lot of those. Radishes I kind of failed at, which I'm kind of sad about. We have always liked pickled radishes. In the first year, 2021 was the only year I successfully got any of my daikons to grow. I am on a mission to get my daikons to be successful because A, I like to pickle them and use them on banh mi's and on tacos and things like that. But I also want to make daikon kimchi because I find the texture of daikon kimchi a little better than the traditional cabbage kimchi. And my stomach seems to approve of it a little bit more. So I want to do that. We'll see if I am successful next year at that. Got a ton of Roma tomatoes. My plants just made it this year for the Romas. So we have a lot of sauce that we need to get through. Already talked about the slicer onions. But the slicer tomatoes, I have nearly doubled the production of this year. And that's because I had a lot more plants. So there was a lot more tomato sandwiches that existed in my life. There was a lot more BLTs that existed in my life. And I probably don't need nearly this amount. I am definitely going to limit the number of tomato plants that come out this year because look at my snacker total. I had 1,800 snacker tomatoes. So this varies in size from cherry to grape to those tiny pears up to the smaller, not necessarily, what would you call those size when they're almost like a tiny plum? I don't know. But these are all of the ones that are too small to be good on a sandwich. That's what I call snackers. The first year I went crazy with the cherry tomatoes, which is why you see that 3,200 total. And then I pared it back in 2022, and then I just went nuts in 2023 with wanting to grow all the varieties. So I got a lot of tomatoes. I'm going to be going through some of our back stock of canned goods probably for a good year and a half before I actually need more tomatoes. But I like fresh tomatoes, so I'm probably going to grow a couple plants. Plus, you have seen in my seed haul that I have a couple new varieties that I have purchased, so I'm probably going to be growing those. Spaghetti squash. Didn't grow any last year or this year because spaghetti squash is just one of those ones that I have to be in the right mood for. Maybe I'll grow it again this year. I think it'll all come down to what they expect us to grow in the test plot this year. And depending on what that is, I'll probably choose other things that are slightly related to that so I can do a comparison. Hot peppers, I was pretty reasonable about this year. Made some good hot sauces. Got a good handful of poblanos for my tacos. Sweet peppers was probably the best year we've had so far. I still don't have as much as I would like to have because I like to put this up in the freezer and then use it throughout the year. But I don't think I will have enough to last us until we start growing peppers again, which makes me sad. Tomatillos, the first year I was actually successful at getting any tomatillos was last year. Found that I don't really like them. It's kind of like the ground cherries. There's something about that flavor I just don't like when it's fresh. And anything that I can use a tomatillo in, I can substitute for a tomato, so I probably won't be ever growing those again. Zucchini, we had a lot of zucchini, and this is because this was the primary test plot crop. With the study, they gave us a variety of zucchini that they wanted us to grow, they wanted us to keep track of, and every time we harvested, we had to say how many we harvested and what the length and circumference of that zucchini was. So that was an adventure, and I think that is all of the different categories of things that I have in here. I'm going to zoom out again because I have these charts where I do a comparison of each of the categories. So the top chart, I have all of the root style vegetables. So the onions, the carrots, the garlics, and the potatoes and the radishes. And then you can see next to each other how each year's harvest has gone. And then the next section is my nightshades, I guess you can call it. My nightshades, my peppers. So all of the different tomatoes and tomatillos and eggplants and then the peppers. You can see how big some of those lines are. The next section is all of my squashes and melons. So of course you've got the butternut and the cucumbers and the pumpkins and the spaghetti squash and the zucchinis. And then this last one is the catch-all for everything else that I didn't know what to do with. So we've got the beans and the cabbage and the celery, the corn and the peas. And you will notice here that there are certain things that I do not keep track of how much I have harvested. And that is the leafy greens, besides the cabbage and the celery. Celery and the cabbage I could keep track of because you're doing a big harvest all at once a lot of the time. Whereas with the lettuce and the spinach, I am picking off so willy-nilly that it would have been too hard to keep track of. I have had guinea pigs, and so I'm constantly pulling lettuce for them. And then of course we have sandwiches that we like to do a lot of that gets either spinach or lettuce. And then I love spinach with my eggs and other things like that. So I was just going out and harvesting them. But how do you keep track of that? I'm doing this counting system and you don't want to count per leaf. And you could do the number of times you've harvested off of it, I suppose. But it's just something that I've never had any interest of keeping track of. So I do think this year has gone well so far. And you can kind of see why I'm thinking about doing beans a little harder this year. Maybe focusing on some bunching onions and things like that. And then leaning back away from tomatoes a little bit and leaning towards some of my sweet peppers. These other categories, I'm not going to go through them because it is a little more dense than a lot of the other stuff I did. This is just me keeping track of how different varieties have done each year. So the first tomato up here on this list, this is the slicer tomatoes. So I have the black pineapple tomato up here where I calculated when I started it, when it started to sprout, how many days that was to sprouting. And then you have the estimated days to harvest that I put in there. So I kind of tried to estimate when I'd be able to start harvesting compared to when I actually harvested. And then you can kind of see the days to harvest right there. And then the amount that I actually pulled off of those plants. So 2022, I had a lot more of those black pineapples, whereas this year I got about half as much. So it's just fun to see this, and this will help me, I'm hoping, in the future to decide which varieties I really want to start focusing on if I don't keep getting distracted by new varieties. We'll see how that goes, which is why I've got all of these different categories which match up with all of the different categories I just showed you on the summary page. So we've got the snackers, we've got the Roma, we've got the hot peppers, we got the sweet peppers, we have the peas and the beans and the carrots. What else do we have? We've got corn and the okra, the green, the garlic, the melons, the onions. The special husk is where I threw the ground cherries and the tomatillos, and there's a lychee tomato that I grew the first year that I only got 20 off of because all of the insects in the area seem to love this plant, so I didn't really get a lot of it. And then the squash and the radishes. One thing I did realize when I was going through this harvest summary, I don't have a space for the okra. Do I want to keep track of the space for the okra? I don't know. There might be some modifications to the spreadsheet later. I don't know if you found any of that information fascinating or not. I find it fascinating, and I just wanted to share that with you. I don't know of anyone who's as weird about record keeping at all of this as I am, and I know this isn't as meticulous as it could be. The thing is, I work with a lot of scientists and farmers at work, and so some of that kind of bleeds through into my actual out-of-work life. So here is my record keeping. I do have a garden journal where I keep track of each day where these numbers come from, and I write a little note of what I did in the garden or what's happening in the garden so that I can look back later and see all of that stuff. Like I said, I will link the video where I talk about all of my spreadsheets up above and down below in case you're interested. I would also love to hear what you thought of my weirdness. Feel free to tell me down below. And if you have any way that you like to keep track of what's happening in the garden, I like to hear about that as well. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe down below, hit the bell, do all the things to get all of the notifications. I also have a Instagram and Threads account in case you want to follow me on there. Otherwise, I hope I will see you in another video, and I heart you beautiful faces. Bye.